Ahoy, adventurers! Your old buddy Hambone is back with another code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This code is good from March 16th to April 11th, and it is called Spring Fun. That's SPRINGFUN Fun. Now, this code is good for 5% off your order, any order $25 or more, and that is good in store or online. So if you are lucky enough to be able to walk through those glorious doors of Noble Knight Games, you can get your discount using the code SPRINGFUN. Or if you're like me and you're ordering from a distance in the Garden State of New Jersey, Spring Fun's the one you're going to want to put in at checkout. Get 5% off your orders of $25 or more, and it's a long code. So if you're hearing this episode later, don't you worry. This code is good from March 16th all the way to April the 11th. So use the code SPRINGFUN and have some fun playing games that you get from our friends over at Noble Knight.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. Who knows what darkness lurks in the hearts of men? Stu Horvath knows.
I mean, I guess. I don't know. That seems like a lot of pressure, Hambone.
I felt like it was topical for what we're going to be talking about today. Listen, they don't all land. We've done enough episodes that the jokes don't always make it.
It's not the point of the jokes. The point is just to have a little bit of heart and something. I don't know. I'm trying to, I don't know. I don't have a good justification for it.
Yeah, it stinks. It's fine. Stu, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking not about a role-playing game or supplement. We're talking about a novel from 1969, Margaret St. Clair's The Shadow People.
Ooh.
So this book is effed up.
Well, I mean, it's old as shit. So a lot of stuff that comes from that era, kind of.
Yeah, but I was surprised, man. Okay, so a little bit of history. The reason I own this book and bought this book, which has a very sweet cover of, it's like a Frazetta knockoff of like a dude with a sword.
Is it Boris Vallejo?
They probably don't have a credit. It's old. Yeah, I mean, come on. It's 1969. They don't credit artists.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah. And it's a terrible indicator of the contents of the books, which you'll understand in a minute. The reason I have the book is because it's in Appendix N, and a bunch of people have told me that it's super interesting and super formative for the creation of Dungeons & Dragons. You could read this book and you could see a lot of the ideas that Gygax brought into the game. From this book comes the idea of the drow and the Underdark, and you could just see other sort of fantasy trope stuff like magic swords and like hallucinogens, like illusion spells. There's a lot of just vibe and just the idea of underground spaces being places of danger and adventure to explore.
Oh, I love when you find out where things got lifted from.
Yeah, but like this is so much more. Like, I've read a whole bunch of Conan. We've all watched the movie. We know that there's a lot of Conan in D&D, right? And we take that for granted. But when you find something new that's sort of out there, and you realize, oh my God, there's so much D&D in this. Intellectually, I know that, oh yeah, no big deal. But emotionally, I'm just like, my God, man.
Oh, that's awesome.
So it's a little bit sad, too, because Margaret St. Clair doesn't have like a crazy career like a Fritz Lieber or Robert E. Howard. Doesn't have like the prestige of that. And I think that's partly just because she was a woman writing science fiction and fantasy in the 60s.
Well, you mean that women were not treated well in the 60s and credited for their work? Go on.
An earlier book called The Sign of the Labyrinths, which is also equally formative. I haven't read that one yet, but it sort of hits a lot of the same notes. Dungeons kind of come out of this book. But on the back cover of the first edition paperback, it says, "Women are writing science fiction!" ! Original! ! Brilliant! 2 exclamation points! Dazzling! !
Wow, they're really trying to sell it with those exclamation points.
Yeah.
Exclamation point.
But contrast that with the back cover copy. Women are closer to the primitive than men.
Oh my God.
They are conscious of moon pulls, the earth tides. They possess a buried memory of humankind's obscure and ancient past, which can emerge to uniquely color and flavor a novel. Such a woman is Margaret St. Clair. They're not even talking about the novel. They're talking about the author.
Oh my gosh.
Author of this novel. Such a novel is this, The Sign of the Labyrinths, the story of a doomed world of the future, saved by recourse to ageless and memorial rights. It's fresh, imaginative, and inventive. It's so desperate. It's like we have a lady writing science fiction. Please read it.
So do you take that, I mean, as an editor, do you take that copy as, well, we're just going to throw this out there and see if anyone buys it, or that's an impassioned plea by editorial, be like, guys, this is awesome. A woman is writing science fiction.
I think it's sort of along the latter, but like more cynical. It's like, we have a woman writing science fiction. That is obviously the only way we can market it as like a novelty, almost like a freak show, I think is the way that reads to me.
Gosh, that's terrible.
It is.
I mean, there's so many different things wrong with that paragraph that, I mean, it's like an onion of oppression. Like, just... one thing after the other. Like, we would be here all day if we dissected it.
Yeah. And it bums me out even more because you read the book, The Shadow People, and you can see that she has had such a huge impact on how we see fantasy. But we don't know it from her work. We know it from Gary Gygax lifting and being inspired by her work.
Right.
And I'm not saying that Gary's a bad guy. You get your inspiration from where you get it from. It's just a bummer that we have not collectively sort of rediscovered and appreciated her work, because this book is freaking good. It's so good. It takes off like a bullet, man. And I'm going to blow your mind because it's set in San Francisco in the 60s.
What?
Right?
Wait a second. So it's modern day fantasy.
Yeah. So, dude swears up and down he's not a hippie, even though he has I think he calls it a luxuriant mustache, and he works for a hip newspaper.
Yeah, it's a hippie.
Yeah, he's a hippie. He's got a girlfriend who lives in a basement sublet and sleeps in a sleeping bag instead of a bed, and she swears that she's not a hippie too.
That's a pretty hippie move, dude.
Yeah. All she really owns is a camera. They get into a fight. He gets, like they kind of break up. And like they go their separate ways, and then he kind of feels bad, so he goes to her basement apartment to see if she's still there and to kind of maybe make up. And he goes in and finds that she's been kidnapped, and there's a really strange smell in the air.
Is it sulfur?
It's a rank, rotten odor, like a dankness.
Okay, go on.
And so he kind of is just like, holy crap, my girlfriend's been kidnapped. He kind of forgets almost immediately. He just throws the ex-girlfriend part out. It's just like, oh, my girlfriend's been kidnapped.
Well, I think in his assumption, it's that, well, if I can rescue her, we are clearly getting back together.
Yeah. So he does all this stuff above ground. He goes to the cops, and the cops don't really take it seriously. They're like, she's a hippie. And like she was sleeping in a sleeping bag. Like maybe she went out, or like maybe she took a trip.
Oh, man. Lairs.
He goes to Big Sur looking for her with some mutual friends. And like he comes back. He lives in a hotel.
Oh, my God.
Hey, man, San Francisco in the 60s.
Is the main character named Jack Kerouac?
The main character's name is named Dick.
Sure, man. Go on.
He goes back to his hotel, and like the cleaning lady, who's not a cleaning lady by what we think of as a cleaning lady, she's just like a woman roughly his age whose job happens to be cleaning the hotel. And like they hang out. It's just like, oh, hey, it's Faye. She cleans my hotel, and sometimes we get drinks together. And she's like our friend.
Yeah, it's a very Mad Men kind of world back in the swinging 60s.
Yeah, it's weird. So like he's like kind of telling Faye that the girlfriend, whose name escapes me at the moment, disappeared, and this, that, and the other thing. And Faye's just like, oh yeah, the Shadow People took her.
Oh, because of course they did.
The people underground took her. They probably took her to eat her. And it's like, and he's just like, understandably like, what the F?
Yeah.
And she's
I
like,
would be too.
And she's like, come down the basement. I'll show you a path that will lead to other people's basements. And through that, you'll find a subterranean tunnel that will lead you into the under earth. And you could maybe track her and find her and bring her home.
Oh, yeah, because it's clearly next to the washing machine, the dryer, and the cases of cigarette ashtrays that we have to replace because people steal them.
Yeah. And to do this, to find the path, he has to follow this wafting rank odor that will lead him deeper into the earth. And so he does. And like there's something super surreal about this because he's just like shot right out of the cannon. Like he doesn't really question it. He's just like, well, Faye said that she's probably been taken by the Shadow People who are gonna eat her. I'd best go get her.
I mean, to be so nonplussed by all of this, In the 60s, I mean, yes, granted, listen, dear listener, I do realize it's a book. But nonetheless, like, no hesitation whatsoever. He's like, okay, just, show me, pass the towels where I need to go, and I'm going to go get my girlfriend back.
Yeah, so he goes on this journey through other people's basements, basically, finds, like, a lower entrance, like, gets down further under the ground, and, like, as he's climbing down, he comes across a sword just hanging on the wall. So he's like, well, screw it, I'm going to take that. And it's like a magic sword, of course.
Of course.
And so the shadow people are elves. They're called elves in the book. There's like 3 or 4 different kinds: black, green, blue, white. I don't know. All of varying castes that are never really entirely defined. They periodically come out to the surface world to forage for, human food, which means food made by humans and also means humans to eat. They are also cannibalistic. There's a lot of violence that's very brutal and like matter of fact, and just like they're scared of steel. They don't like it. So like they kind of leave him alone, but he like just is walking down a cavern and there's like a whole bunch of elves beating on each other, like trying to kill each other. He's just like, what? And like obviously with the intent to eat.
So this is 1965?
69.
Okay, so Star Trek, the original series, has already come out.
Yeah.
And so people have a general idea of like, colorful monsters and mutants and like weird scenarios and weird locations. So this is not, I mean, granted, it's pretty far out of left field. That said, it's not totally out of left field, like the world that she's kind of creating and imagining under these San Francisco streets. So these elves were like the original Chuds.
It's complicated and it never really gets satisfactorily explained. There's a little bit of Merlin being involved. It's Merlin's sword. And Faye, of course, the lady who's cleaning the hotels, is actually the queen of the elves who just like abandoned fairyland or Shadowland or Underworld, whatever you call it.
So wait a second. Basically, what you're telling me is Faye is like, yeah, I'm the queen of all these weirdos, but I'm going to go fold laundry and smoke unfiltered cigarettes up top in the sun. Deuces.
Pretty much.
Wow.
Yeah. So...
Of course.
And of course, the narrator finds out that he's a hybrid elf, like he has elf blood in his line. But okay, so it gets weirder. There's 2 more things, 2 more levels of weird. So it's a quest book, and he goes underground, and the underground section is absolutely fantastic. Because she's so direct and spare with her descriptions, like there's not a lot going on, but she just conveys it so well. This idea of being in a dark, claustrophobic underground space. Like you get like the dankness, like the running water, the darkness, trying to navigate that, the idea of how sound bounces around. It's so good. It's so good that anybody running D&D should read this book just to like get that feeling.
Well, I definitely want to read this book.
It's so bizarre.
You sold me like 5 minutes ago. FYI.
So it totally gets weirder. The elves don't necessarily have like a steady food supply because it's underground. There's no crops. So aside of eating each other and eating humans and going to the surface and getting human food, they have this weird grain that there's a fungus that grows on that's provided by this demented gray dwarf who's kind of like a duergar.
Ooh.
Yeah. And the mold that's on the grain, which they call addercorn, is a hallucinogenic.
San Francisco, 1969, hallucinogenic.
Oh, yeah. So
was this hotel on the corner of both Haight and Ashbury? Was that what was going on here?
They do mention that. Oh, wait. I guess it's Berkeley. They're in Berkeley. So
Okay.
they're on the other side of the bay.
Yeah.
Still, it's pretty hip. So the drug is crazy. The way she describes it, he has to eat it to survive. So he gets into this cycle. So the hallucinations are incredibly powerful. He's constantly envisioning himself as an animal, and the animal changes every few minutes. So like he'll be walking down a tunnel and he'll think he's like a deer, but then like a second later he'll think he's a fox. And he's a little confused as to whether he's in a tunnel or a forest. It's super weird. And as soon as he gets out of the high part of the hallucination, dead tired. So he basically like collapses and has to rest for like 6 hours. Wakes up from that, deadly hungry, has to eat the addercorn again, starts hallucinating. And the cycle is just like this constant thing that happens. And it's just like brutal. And they're all doing it. So that's like another level of weird.
Dear listener, if you're ever planning on going on an adventure underground to rescue a loved one that may not love you back in the way that you love them, always stop at the store, get a backpack, get some granola bars, a couple bottles of water. Don't adventure without some food.
He does pack some sandwiches.
So does he run out of sandwich? Like, how long is he down there for?
So that's where it gets even weirder. He thinks he's gone for a couple of weeks. He actually is down there for 3 years.
Oh, he definitely ran out of sandwiches. Yep, that'll do it.
He gets out, and the U.S. has devolved into a fascist techno state. What? Yeah, this book gives so much.
Was the writer on acid?
I feel like she's a Bay Area lady, and I wouldn't be surprised.
Swinging 60s.
Yeah, so, Berkeley, the most liberal city in America, there's police robots that go around, everybody has ID cards. There's riots that are suppressed by gases and stuff. And there's this weird sci-fi dystopia thing that's going on.
He was only gone 3 years.
Yeah, I know, but a lot happened.
Jeez.
They leveled the Berkeley Hills. It's crazy. And all of this totalitarian techno state that happens, it's heavily implied, but never really explained, that this is all part of a plan by the smarter elves to take over the surface world once and for all.
Stu, that's a thin book. For those listening at home, it is a little back pocket reader we're talking here. This is not a 700-page Stephen King book here. It's got to be 180 pages max?
189.
Wow.
Yeah, it packs so much in, and this ending is totally unsatisfying. You just don't get nearly enough. She does such a great job of presenting all of this stuff to you that you want to know more, and you never get it. And I've been thinking about this book for months.
How many books in the series?
That's it. Just the one.
She just wrote the one.
Yeah, The Shadow People is a standalone novel. This is before the days of series, really.
Well, Gygax was always hey, if you want to understand the world, he kind of told you, if you want to be a better storyteller, if you want to be better at doing this, these are the books that I read. These are where a lot of the ideas and vibe came from.
Yeah.
I think that is still a great thing, and I think that any role-playing system that comes out nowadays, they're almost doing themselves a disservice by not kind of giving you a little more thing to sink your teeth into it. Because also, for me, from a sales perspective, I'm also looking at that well, you're solidifying the sale into Dungeons and Dragons, because it's hey, I've come up with this wonderful game system. Now, if you go and you look into other things, you kind of stay inspired. You're going to want to keep playing this game more. Real slick. And that said, I think it's cool that a book like this exists, because as you're telling it to me, I am visualizing what you were describing, and I am seeing the Underdark and the world that would become Menzoberranzan.
Yep.
And a lot of key things that happened and occurred in the Underdark, very much inspired by this book.
Totally. But a book that doesn't really resemble D&D. There's no technocratic fascist state in D&D. There's no robots. There's not really hallucinogens.
Yeah, not that I can think of off the top of my head. There's different no, I can't even think of anything off the top of my head that would make you that whacked out of your brain.
Yeah. Well, I want to just correct for the record that Appendix N, I believe I used the word lifted before when I said Gary Gygax lifted from this book.
Right.
I think that that's not true. Appendix N is him citing his inspirations, and he's honest about it. He said that these books inspired me, and it's cool that he did that so that we could go back and read it and have our minds blown, because the book is crazy.
My mind is blown. I actually want to read this book now. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on the Shadow People?
My final thought on the Shadow People is that you should try and track down a copy and read it, because it's just fantastic. It's so weird. It informs so much about Dungeons & Dragons, but it also challenges your preconceived notions about what fantasy role-playing could be, because it's so different.
Well, there you go, folks. This was another episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me at Vintage RPG on Instagram every day, typing out stuff and putting up pictures about stuff like the Shadow People and getting my mind blown periodically. Oh my God, this book, people, you told me about this. You guys made me read this book, and thank you.
Aw, that's awesome. Well, now you have a lot to talk about in reference to the book, because you read the darn thing.
Yeah.
And Hambone's going to read it too. You can find me on Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons & Dragons. I tweet about professional wrestling. You could also find my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. And if you're looking for another fun podcast to listen to, you could check out my pop culture podcast, My Thai Happy Hour. It's pop culture for weirdos wherever podcasts are found. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.